Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The flooding that we've all endured for these past several days has brought the inevitable comparisons to the Great Ohio River Flood of 1937. With me today is author and historian John Robertson of Paducah, who probably knows as much about the 1937 flood as anyone. John taught for many years here at the college. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the inevitable comparison. How does the great flood of the spring of 2011 stack up, measure up to the Ohio River flood of 1937?
Well, of course, it's the second highest ever. But compared to the impact of the 37 flood, it was a minor irritant. When you have 26,000 people evacuated, when you have damage to the extent that we had without the flood wall, when you have the expenditure of money to repair what occurred, and all of that, plus dislocation and the fact that we had people from Paducah who were forced to go as far away as Knoxville to find refuge. And that hasn't happened here. And of course, during the 37 flood, they brought in regular troops from Fort Sheridan and established martial law with orders to shoot anybody that went into the town. So they had forcible evacuation, and yet there were people who hid out.
Oh, they did.
All during the
Indeed,
time.
they did.
So I think we've been quite fortunate, and I hope we appreciate the other thing. The 37 flood, the only flood we've ever had in the middle of the winter. Devastatingly cold, in addition to all of the other problems.
Why did the flood happen? Just enormous rainfall throughout December of 1936 throughout the Ohio Valley?
Well, in its report on the 37 flood, the Red Cross noted that it was greater in damage than the great 27 flood on the Mississippi or the Dust Bowl. So to that date, it was the most devastating thing that had ever happened to the United States.
Right.
And they pointed out that over the entire Ohio Valley that winter, in less than a month, there was enough rain to cover 204,000 square miles to a depth of 11.2 inches. And if you think about the location of Paducah, not only did we have the Ohio River to contend with, look where we are. We got all of the tributaries coming in, just starting up with, at the Wabash and the Tradewater and the Cumberland and the Tennessee, and all of that drained here. And so we get all of it jammed down our throat, and it had to go somewhere.
Yes.
And when it burst across without the flood wall, of course, when they got up the hill, it just flowed wherever nature would let it. And I think the story is that at the height of the flood, the width of the Ohio River at the location of Paducah was estimated to be about at least 30 miles.
Which is an estuary, not a river.
Which is an estuary
Right.
that runs all the way up to, I guess it's to Harrisburg, Illinois.
Well, you think about the southern Illinois, until you get to those hills, it's
Goreville,
very flat, very flat.
The last ice age ended up there, and it's all flat.
Well, I think one of the things that really puts this in perspective in Paducah is you go out to Jefferson beyond 28th, and there is an eagle monument in the grass plot, and that's about how far it got.
Yeah, actually on Broadway, it went out to LaBelle Avenue where the Coca-Cola plant is. And that's where they landed the boats that were.
I said Jefferson, I meant Broadway.
Yeah, okay.
It's on Broadway, exactly right. I don't know what I'm thinking.
So that was about the extent. And to the west. And of course, there's very little development in the west at the time. But they moved the city government out to the old Jack Cowler place on Broadway there. And they moved the county records. Everything had to go.
Right, right.
And they
Well, I know the
used
newspaper.
the schools out there as hospitals.
Yeah.
What's now the middle school and Clark School.
Right.
They became emergency hospitals.
Right. Well, I know that the Paducah Sun-Democrat was published in Mayfield at the time, which is an unusual cooperation between two rival papers. But in an emergency, people did turn to there.
Yeah.
Do we want to look at some photographs that we have at this point from the 1937 deluge?
Actually, this is 1913, just for comparison.
Oh, good. Okay.
Now, this is in Paducah, 3rd Avenue was almost a natural conduit bringing water into the downtown area. And when you hit the cross current there at 3rd and Broadway, a lot of the little skiffs, you see them, they're quickly made. They have about 3 inches of clearboard.
Yeah.
They could not steer unless they had a keel. And so I've heard of people that were dumped in the water. And of course, during the 37 flood, when it was cold,
Oh, wow.
and devastated in downtown.
Now, this was in the spring, April or so?
This was about the height of the flood, and of course in the spring. And Paducah kind of celebrated. Look at this. The guy's out having a good time.
Mm-hmm.
He's got on a dress suit and a tie.
And standing in water up to his knees. Yeah.
Well, man, let's get out and play in the water.
Right.
So that's the difference between 13 and 37. But everybody said, well, it'll never get any higher than 13.
Right.
That was the highest to date.
Right.
Now, this is 37, and look where it is. It's out at about Fountain Avenue. And these two guys in the canoe were bundled up for the weather.
Yes.
And that canoe was not a very safe craft in the flood.
No.
Now, this is looking from the top of the Cobb out westward, and you see the rivers became former streets.
Like the canals of Venice, Italy.
Yeah. And they actually ran some steamboats as far out as about 16th.
Is that right?
And there were 2 steamboats docked here in repairs, and they had pulled the motor and were working on them, things like that. And one of the people on one of those boats was Jimmy Curtis, who later had Curtis and May Studios here in town.
Right.
And we interviewed him about his experience during the flood. So they lent him to the city of Paducah, and he was the official ambulance driver, which was a boat.
A water ambulance.
And if you look going out here, you see the small craft. Well, look to the side. What do you see? This is wintertime, cold. And a lot of the cars, here's ice in the middle of Kentucky Avenue. That's the old city hall up there. And this is one of the boats that was isolated
I
here.
believe that's the steamer St. Paul. So that was a lifeboat taken off that steamboat.
Off of it.
Yeah.
And it served as a relief vessel.
Well, now, those buildings,
That's the old
of course, that's
McCracken County Courthouse.
Right.
And at first they brought refugees in there.
Uh-huh.
And of course they had rigid segregation. And so they put all the blacks in the lower level, and very quickly the water quit running and the toilets quit flushing, and Mr. Jackson's family decided they had enough and they left. And but they had to finally evacuate them entirely.
Now that's the Civil War era courthouse, isn't it?
Yeah, and it became the hospital number 2.
Wow.
And that was the headquarters of Nathan Bedford Forrest when he was in the Battle of Paducah.
Wow.
Now,
there's a really wonderful story behind this. Tell us the story of the what might be the first drive-up by boat liquor window in the United States.
You would drive by and ring a bell, and Mr. Oschlager, that window there to the right, between cigar and drugs, he would open it up, and you would tell him that you wanted something. He'd lower a bucket down to you. You'd pull the bucket up. He would go in and get his stock, and put it in it and drop it down to you, and then you put your money, and off you went. Well, he had to reconsider because a couple of guys motored up.
Yeah, I've heard this story.
And he dropped the bucket.
And they took off.
They took off with after they got the whiskey.
So after that, it was cash
But
first,
it was
then
cash,
liquor.
cash and carry.
Now that building today is it gone?
Yes.
And where did it stand?
About 16th, I think it was.
Okay.
Now this shows some of the people trying to get out of the flood.
Now, very quickly, Paducah lost its electricity, and
Not really. If you look, this shows it as well as anything. Look at all the poles in the downtown area.
that's the 1913.
That's from 1913, but
Yeah.
it was still the same
Right.
in 1937. All the telephone, telegraph were on poles. And so it was up out of the water. In fact, you had electricity in downtown Paducah long after the city was evacuated. But they had to, danger was, of course, fire. And so...
And we should mention that Bill Powell was a
Bill
great
Powell,
journalist with the
was
Paducah
gracious
Sun-Democrat.
enough, his wife gave me his files of photographs, and these are some from his files of the 37 flood. So here you see just masses of people in the downtown area. And this is the regular Army troops who came in. There was already a WPA camp here in 37. And so they were sort of mustered in, and they helped supply some of the surveillance of the downtown area. But these guys came in with 1903 Springfield rifles with clips of real ammunition and told to use them after they officially ordered everybody to evacuate downtown Paducah. There were people who had passes, and they were allowed in the downtown area. Like Mr. Jackson, for example, he was allowed in and out. Others, like the city government, after they had to leave the city hall, moved into the Cobb Hotel. And they would land on the marquee, you see it here, and then you'd get on the roof of the marquee and go into the hotel.
That's amazing.
And they had people trying to ride out the flood in some of the hotels downtown. But after they lost their heat, and more importantly, after they lost the water.
Yes.
Because without the pumps on the water, everything, sewage and everything else was coming up through the toilets.
A story I heard along those lines was Oscar Cross
Yes.
told me years ago that they would row out to these big water storage tanks for railroad locomotives.
Well,
and get water out
no,
of
they
that.
tried to weather the flood out by staying, this is the black community, on the second floor of a Lincoln High School, a new building at the time. And without water, as you say, they did roll over to the NC and STL railroad yards. And while they were there, they would fill up all their containers. And right near there was a grocery store that told them, said, come in to get whatever you want. We've lost it. And so they would go in and pick up cans for the people to eat, staying on the second floor of the
and I also heard that when the water got on the cans, the labels came off.
came
You know
off,
what you
and
had.
it was,
You
never knew what you were
can
getting.
luck instead of pot luck. Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how resilient people were. But you're absolutely right. It's the old water everywhere, but not a drop to drink,
Right.
because this is filthy river water.
Oh, it was horrible. And of course, what really caused them to evacuate the town was the threat of cholera, flooding, diphtheria, other things. So it was a health decision.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That forced them out.
Yeah.
Now this is odd because if you look at it, you have mixed races in the same boat. That was almost unheard of at the time. Now a lot of the people in the black community tried to weather the flood by going to the West Kentucky Industrial College, which was one of the first institutions of higher education in the western part of Kentucky. And it was to supply teachers for the black schools. it still exists as a part of what is now West Kentucky Vocational Tech, where we are.
Right.
But the black college was a post-secondary school.
Right.
And so they tried to ride it out, and all the black community went there for haven, and finally they had to evacuate them. Now their story is really different. We were interviewing survivors of the flood as a project for the Kentucky Humanities Council, and among the people that we interviewed were several who experienced this devastating evacuation that was forced upon the people of Paducah. And the black community, after they were forced to leave the vocational school, well, where would they go? They put them on the IC railroad, and back then, all the motive power was steam. Mm-hmm. And you could run a steamer through up to about 30 inches of water. Mm-hmm. And so they still managed to get people out of here. Mm-hmm. But after you got them out, where would they go? And so all these black refugees got to the town of Princeton, and the mayor wouldn't let them stop. And so finally, according to Mr. Robert M. Anderson, when we interviewed him, he was 86. And Reverend Anderson remembered very clearly what happened to him. He was 17 when the 37 flood hit. And so he moved from his home on 10th Street to a shelter in a school. And he says there was lots of praying. So I've never done or heard that much in a church. Mm-hmm. And people tried to ride it out. And Anderson was one of about 100 people who were evacuated to the town of Princeton. He said the mayor of the town complained about too many black refugees. And so all the blacks in the group, about 85 people, were put on a train to Knoxville, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. That's all the way across the state of Tennessee.
Oh, yeah.
And there they were given brand new overalls and typhoid shots and lodged at the University of Tennessee. And the building where they were had 3 floors. And so the women stayed on the 3rd floor. Mm-hmm. The men stayed on the 2nd floor. And the 1st floor was for eating and that sort of thing. And of course, it was also set up that you couldn't really go from the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor. But the point I wanted to make about this is these were the guests of the people of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. They took them in when nobody else would. But even so, they were locked in the building at night. Mm. Mm. So they had a guard on the door. And so he said to fight boredom, we'd go up where the women were. He says his group were in Knoxville for a couple of weeks before returning to Paducah. And yet, if you look at the Knoxville newspapers, when these people arrived, they had a big front page picture of a young colored boy who had just been born, I think, en route. And it made the paper that day. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So along with everything else they had to contend with was the rigid segregation mm-hmm. of the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I thought that was rather compelling. Wow. Now this shows the landing of the relief boats. You could go out Broadway until you begin to run to ground. About, actually LaBelle Avenue was the end where the Coca-Cola plant is.
Well, the marker then, that would be what it's a
little before that.
You get Jefferson. Off, you cross 28th Street there on Broadway, and you keep coming out. Do you know why they put it there and not farther back toward the?
No, because I think originally it was on the court on the post office.
Right, but I just wondered why, because I've been told that the actual water extended beyond where the monument is now.
You could go out further on Broadway than you could on Jefferson.
Yeah.
And so you see they built ramps so people could go as far as they could
Right.
and then walk the remainder
Right.
of the distance, and they let them out there. Well, a look on the roof. Snow. That made it that much worse in 37. And so here you have refugees that they had to bring their the rattles and passels along with them. Whatever they could bring is what they could carry. And everything else, they would try to put things up. One of the great stories of the 37 flood was it converted Paducahans from being entertained by gathering around the piano in the evening
Right.
to around the radio, because during the 37 flood, they put all their pianos up on blocks. They were too big to move, and when they couldn't move them, and the water got to them. Well, I remember Mr. Black, Ray Black and Sons, talking about coming into the house, and his piano was still there in perfect shape. They touched it, and it just disintegrated. It collapsed into the pieces.
Somebody told me, it might have been Mary Iser, that a lot of these pianos were buried in a pit over by the railroad shops.
It was. They took them all out to an area that later where they built the shops. And, well, they'd already built the shops, I beg your pardon, but in that area. And they dumped them. And then again, you know, what are your entertainment? Well, it was easier to buy a radio than it was to buy a piano.
Yeah.
And so I pointed that out in a book
But
or two.
I believe, of course, she had told me that the one article of furniture that was so difficult to move upstairs was a piano, obviously.
Oh, you
So
couldn't
you
do
could
it.
move your tables and chairs and whatnot, but the piano would be lost.
And a lot of times they stayed in those homes on, like on Jefferson, most of them two-story. They would actually roll in the front door and roll up to the landing, and the water got up usually about that high.
Right.
And they'd get out on the landing and go upstairs. But even so, up there, you're over a cold, wet, damp
miserable.
environment.
Right.
And it was devastating to the health of the people involved.
Well, just to clear up a point, where that that boat ramp is, that was on Jefferson or Broadway?
That was on Broadway.
Right. Okay.
was on
But now
Broadway.
the monument though is
It's
on
on
Jefferson.
Jefferson.
Ah, that's
And
what had
it
me
was-
confused.
It was difference in,
Exactly.
it bottomed out quicker on Jefferson.
Okay, so where that monument is on Jefferson is about
about
where the water was.
on Jefferson.
Okay, that clears it up. That clears it up.
Yeah. And interesting assets there also, in that same area, there was the Twinkling Star nightclub and restaurant. And one of the local city workers rode up to it and took out a .45 automatic and broke out the door, and they opened it up, and it was used to feed all the refugees.
Wow.
And so it served as sort of the well, the commissary for food for the workers.
Was that railroad embankment there during the flood?
No. The railroad embankment?
Yeah. There.
Yeah, I guess it was. Yeah, it had to be. Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the IC.
Right.
Okay,
right,
yeah.
Right.
It was
Right.
there.
Right.
Yeah.
Fire.
Fire.
And
And when you had a fire, you couldn't fight it. And Paducah had a couple of devastating fires like this one downtown. This is where the fire chief was severely injured.
and I
Chief
believe
Slaughter.
I believe he died in the hospital in Mayfield.
He died in, I'm not sure it was in Mayfield.
Well, they evacuated him and he
They
died in the hospital. Right.
evacuated
So how
him.
did they? You said Paducah had a fire boat, and they used that.
They
some?
did have a fire boat that you could pump, but it was not very successful. And so when the fire broke out, like one to the Hank House on what is now Fountain Avenue, two-story house, beautiful thing, they just sat and watched it burn. And so that was another reason why they ordered the evacuation,
Right.
because
Oh,
it was not
yeah,
safe to stay downtown.
Well, you know, I have read that most of the cities that were inundated had big fires. Louisville and
Oh,
other
yeah.
cities did that.
Now this shows the attempt to wide it out. People would get on the second floor, and but now where would you get your drinking water?
Exactly.
What would you do with your waste? You had a chamber pot. Well, out the window it went. And so that contaminated the rivers even more. But look at these, just look at that boat.
Yeah, yeah, not very
They knocked
seaworthy.
those things together very quickly. That has, I would think, 3 inches of freeboard. And if they
I had Paul Moore, the former city building inspector, on the program, and he said that when the railroad shop was still above water, they made John boats.
They made
in there.
John boats.
And
they were good ones.
Yeah, yeah. Now the Rudy Has It, that was a well-known department store in Paducah, was it? Rudy's department store?
Rudy. And they had the Rudy family had well, they were also in Union County. They had one of the bakeries there. So the family was
Now that scene obviously is looking out toward the river, but about what street would that be?
Kentucky and First.
And what were those factories out there? Were those chimneys?
That was the water plant, I believe.
Okay.
Water treatment.
Yeah, yeah.
Look at all of this. They had a barge.
Right.
And they would tie them up. See, it's tied up almost to the roof of the
You could step off
house.
the roof very easily, and you could
step
also see a
off the
bit of
house
snow.
and-
That's a famous photograph of
That's
the interior of the
inside
Cobb Hotel.
Cobb Hotel.
Yeah.
And you could see why they tried to stay there for a while. The city had the government up on the mezzanine there.
Right.
That's
right.
what the city offices
There is
were.
also a photo from the flood of a canoe in the lobby of the Cobb.
Oh, yes.
I've seen that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Gosh.
of course, now accommodations were scarce when they moved out to the West End. So they put people wherever they could find room and stashed them in with just practically, people didn't know each other, they would take people in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, some of the old churches were severely damaged by the flood and later had to be torn down, and just like the synagogue was severely damaged.
Right. Right. Now that's Broadway Methodist, isn't it?
I believe that one is, yeah.
Yeah.
But here again, look at the current.
Absolutely.
And all of this time, the automobiles, it was winter, unless you had alcohol and the motor froze up. And they went out to try to start the car, and they lost so many cars simply because they couldn't move them. And if you look up Broadway there, you can see parked cars
Right.
parked
They're just-
along the side of the street. And it became a hazard to navigation.
And I had read that a lot of body shops were doing repair to the roofs of cars. I mean, how many
Well, the
times
roof were
it hit by
usually
boats?
cloth.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Curtis said that what he would do, he would take a bunch of rods, and when they were making an ambulance run or something like that, when they would come by a sunken car,
Yeah.
they would run that pole through the cloth
So you
roof
can see it.
so you could see it, because when a boat went by, even if they were underwater, the current would move them up, and suddenly they became a hazard to navigation.
Wow.
You hit one of them with a lot of those boats,
Wow.
they'd turn them over. And
Now-
you do not want to be turned over in that water.
Oh no.
Now, you
This
see
is
the Army trucks and CC where they were
This
letting
is
them out
now this is at
at 28th and
Broadway.
Broadway.
okay.
So they're walking up the final part. They couldn't get up any closer, so they walked up and bringing people out on stretchers
Yeah.
and
Wow.
bringing corpses and whatever.
How many people died in Paducah approximately during the flood?
I really don't know.
It wasn't very many.
Not many.
Considering.
This is the
the Ritz Hotel.
Ritz Hotel,
Yeah.
which is still there
Yeah.
in the West End, and you can see that's still up to the first floor.
Yes.
And these houses were just, well, usually if you had a second floor, it would be above water. But see these,
I'm amazed at these boats.
there's the house,
yeah.
there's the
There's a car.
hazard,
Right. Exactly.
and you can see the roof. Now look at the size of that barge they're pushing.
And this is the one that the two motorboats are pushing it like a
Yes.
towboat.
It's an evacuation boat.
Right. It is. Look at that.
And this is looked like a part of the black community moving in mass. So, and this is also, these were
That's a Coast
Navy
Guard. Yeah.
Coast Guard
Yeah.
boats. And if you look at it, there's a tiller on it.
Right.
That's unusual.
Now,
This
that's
is
that's way overloaded at
That's a
speedboat.
commercial
Yeah.
speedboat.
Yeah.
And
That
then you
would-
have the creative ones.
Right.
But
You look at this one. You think, I mean, it wouldn't take anything to tip that over.
yeah, they have, if they were flat and didn't have any form of keel, that's a board running down
Right.
the bottom.
Right.
They were very difficult to row.
bet.
You
Oh.
couldn't make them go in a particular direction. And if you hit a cross current, they would tend
You
to
could
tip
be
over.
swamped. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you passed a boat going fast, look out.
Yeah. Oh, the wake. Sure. Sure. Look at that one.
Yeah, they move along. Dean Matheson parked his car behind his house and rented up on a pile of ashes. So the motor was up out of the water.
Yeah.
And after the flood was over, he went out and started it up.
It was all right. Wow.
But a lot of people weren't that happy.
Now this is the,
This is the Illinois Central Hospital.
which is the Catterjohn building now.
It's the Catterjohn building. When the flood started, the hospital tried to continue operations, but then they lost their power and they lost their heat. Water got into the boiler. So they built a track over from the roundhouse over to Broadway, ran a steam engine over there and parked it, and then ran tubing from it to the hospital, and they supplied the hospital with heat for a while.
Wow.
And so the hospital finally was forced to evacuate because, well,
That's another shot of the car, but you can see
Yeah.
the water's higher now than
Right.
it was before.
so people tried desperately to cope, but they didn't know what they were coping with. It had never been that high before. And they had about, if you think about something else, when this thing hit and the rail, remember the waters were overhead. Not the waters, the wires, telephone wires, overhead. And when they began to break and snap through the ice and everything else, Paducah was isolated. And other people did not know the desperate plight of the people here. They had two radios, one for the Corps of Engineers, and another was a man who had a ham radio set. And so for a while, a lot of people in Kentucky didn't know how bad it was in Paducah.
Yeah.
Now, David Carlson, his mother lived right across from the IC hospital. And he was the one that told me about the attempt to continue heating it by using a steam engine. And when the last train left here, from the roundhouse out, they were going to Mayfield, and the fireman, a black fireman, got off the engine in icy water and waded ahead and felt the rail
Right.
to make sure it was lined up because it was underwater.
Paul Moore, the building inspector, he took that last train out
Yeah.
of Paducah,
See, this is in front of the...
and you can see the snow on top of that car too.
yeah.
Now this is where?
Well, this
That's
is
lower.
the Hotel Palmer.
Right, which is a very nice hotel.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And it had a beautiful restaurant, Boswell. It was the dining place of Paducah.
That's where Boswell, because I remember
Yeah.
Boswell's when it was out on Park Avenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you see the devastation.
From a
hitting-
fire. Yeah.
And, well, just unbelievable, the area that was just absolutely made untenable for human living.
Wow.
And all this time, some boats were forced to stay here and ride it out. Now, they were, another reason they evacuated the town, they were afraid those gasoline tanks there would float and burst
Right.
and cause a massive fire
Or would have.
that could not have been coped
Of
with.
course, gasoline burns on top
yeah,
of water.
on top of the water.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So fear of fire had a major factor in the
Yeah.
evacuation of Paducah,
Wow.
even though the town was covered by water.
Yeah. What were the total damages assessed in Paducah? How many millions of dollars do you know?
No, I've seen estimates, and I probably quoted those somewhere, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
It was in the millions, I'm sure.
It was in, yes.
Yeah.
And in 1913, the people of Paducah paid for the entire flood damage themselves, amounted to about $4,000 or $5,000. And so they thought that they got off fairly easy. In 1937, the damage was just devastating because once the flood was over and they started moving back in, for example, the old college, PJC, down at 7th and Broadway, people stayed in it during most of the flood. And they tried to keep it going, but of course water got into the boiler. And so they forced them to evacuate. And when the people left, they left the water taps on. And so when they turned the water back on in the city of Paducah, the damage of that building was from what?
People leaving the tap.
People leaving the
wow.
water on.
Wow.
So you had stories like that.
Yeah.
But all of those, before they could move back in, all of the boilers had to be inspected. And they had to be dried out very slowly and carefully.
Sure.
Because otherwise they would explode. And so we had a slow process. You had to get tickets and permission. Oh, this is a famous picture. Dogs were oftentimes marooned. And there's a famous story by Mr. Dub Beasley, Walter Beasley, who near his house, they saw a flat shed that had several dogs and cats and squirrels and everything else all on top of the same building and getting along with each other.
Right.
They came to an accommodation.
The funny story about that I believe comes from the 1987 flood edition of the Paducah Sun, which I worked on with a fellow named Lynn McDaniel. And this picture, to us, just said it all. This is absolutely the best picture we saw. And so when we published it, this Wash Turner's family called in and said, yeah, that's Wash Turner. And they even said the name of the dog. I forget what that was. And then other people started calling in saying, well, that was Uncle Fred, or whatever, and that was his dog Spot.
I think there were, 4?
Something like that, so we just gave up. But the image of that is, of course, on the flood wall. It just says it all, that in this terrible time, here this fella is mugging for the camera with his dog on the roof of this building.
And look, he has a tie.
Yeah, exactly. Now this is absolutely the most famous.
Most famous picture.
Tell the story of how this cow got up on the second-story porch.
The owner of the house and the cow, of course, wanted to make sure that cows can't stay long in water.
Right.
Their feet will rot.
Exactly.
And so they had this milk cow. And they had this 2-story house, and they had to evacuate. And so Jimmy Houston decided that he would put the cow up on the second floor. And
which is no mean feat.
Oh, no. Now, his uncle went with him. And they got the cow started up, but the cow didn't want to go. And so finally Jimmy took its tail and kinked it and probably broke it. But the cow went up all the way at one time.
Yeah.
Now, it was up there, and then what do you do with it? He became injured from, Jimmy had pneumonia, I guess it was.
Yeah.
And went into hospital, and his, by the way, he met his future wife while he was in the hospital, Evelyn. Evelyn was about 16, and she was an aide
Right.
that was working at where the hospital was out in the West End.
Right.
In Clark School, I believe it was, and so she helped take care of Jimmy.
Yeah.
And she wore some high boots and a riding outfit, and he remembered her.
He was taken with him. Right. Right.
So they got together and married.
So the cow, of course, was fed all through the flood and milk.
Yes, after he became unable to go, passing Coast Guard and our people continued to feed the cow. So it became a very famous image of Paducah.
It was in the National Geographic magazine. Wasn't
Yes,
it?
it was actually in the National Geographic. The magazine was, I've got it somewhere in my notes, but I don't see it off the top of my head.
Well, a few years ago, a couple that moved in there, I think, had planned to turn it into a restaurant called
Yes,
the Stranded Cow.
Yes, it was called the Stranded Cow, and they redid it, and it is still down there.
Now I think we're going to switch into the
Current.
the flood of 11, and the red is the bad stuff. That's the flooded area. Now I believe in 37, 90% of Paducah was underwater to some extent, something like
Well,
that.
remember the city limits was different too.
Right. Well, that's also true. That's
Yeah,
also
it
true.
went out to the city limits.
Yeah, yeah. Now that, of course, is all in McCracken County.
Yeah.
And you can see the obvious areas down on the lower left-hand side as well, Mayfield Creek. Now, this is Metropolis, which is also heavily hit by this stuff. And we've got some pretty remarkable photographs that...
Well, Brookport, Metropolis, and Gulf, well, a lot of places were hit badly.
and here are this is the flood crest. I believe as we speak, and of course this is subject to change, it's expected to crest at about, they were saying 55.5 feet.
Yeah, it's up to.
And of course in 37 it was 60.8. So that is significant. That would make this the second. It would make it second only to 37.
I think it's supposed to crest at 58, isn't it?
Well, they talked about that, and of course here again, that's blowing those levees. Blowing the levees may, and that's kind of why we're talking here.
Yes.
Putting in the floodgates.
Of course, they never even thought about blowing the levees in 37. That New Madrid spillway.
Yeah.
And it was actually done just recently.
Right.
And I think the last charge is ready to go off about the time we're talking
Is
here.
that right? Well, we'll try not to shake if it does. But of course, that's all they could do to save these towns. It was Cairo and on down to New Madrid.
It's not only the pressure on the flood wall at Cairo. That soil over there is different.
It's
almost loose.
Oh, it is. It is loose.
And what you get into is sand boils.
Right.
And
now, I remember that from the Mississippi flood of a few years ago. When we saw those sand boils, we started running.
And in 1927, they saw whole trees come just popping up out of the ground.
Right, right. But again, blowing the levees, it saved Cairo and New Madrid and Hickman and all these little towns.
Now there's one of the most, to me, stupid things that ever happened in the city of Paducah. To allow people to build a massive structure outside of the existing flood wall.
Well, I've often questioned that myself, but...
I think he was afraid of unions. Unions were not in great favor in Paducah in 37. You had some railroad unions.
And when Bob Greene built that,
he
absolutely hated unions.
And this is interesting because this is the location of the first county seat of McCracken County.
Wilmington.
At Wilmington.
Was that named for Wilmington, Delaware? Or
probably. But here it is, and it in Wilmington flooded in 1824, 25, and they had to move the whole county seat. And Braxton Small, the county court clerk, took all the city records, put them in his hat, got in a rowboat and rode to Paducah.
Oh, that's a great story.
And so Paducah, the last city to be founded in the Jackson Purchase. See, in 1827, Paducah didn't exist.
Wow.
And the county was still up
Now
and
this
functioning.
is a community called High Point.
Yes, High
which
Point.
Dan Shepard and Tom Butler, who shot these remarkable
I
pictures,
think that is high in the water now.
thought it was underwater. So I guess that was not. That would be maybe called the not high enough.
Not quite
point.
high enough for it.
Yeah, yeah. And again, this water, it's over roads, and people very foolishly drive into it.
Well,
and
people are not
can,
accustomed
and it can be fatal.
to dealing with flood. In my generation, it was not uncommon to have to deal with floods.
Well, of course, cars were higher up in those.
Cars
yeah.
were higher.
Right.
You could take, say, a Model A with high wheels, or a Model T or something like that, and you could run through almost 3 feet of water.
Wouldn't try that with a modern vehicle.
No, because you had to have some know-how then.
This really is an impressive photo.
Yeah.
You see that the gate.
The gate.
I mean, that just gives you an idea how high that water is.
But you had to disconnect your fan belt.
Yeah.
And who could disconnect a fan belt today?
Exactly.
Well,
And
this
farmland.
shows
Oh, wow.
barns, big.
Oh yeah.
Oh, man,
now
now
this
this.
is Metropolis. This really struck me too. That's the gateway into the Harrah's.
Yeah,
and
think of the spillover cost to
Oh
this
yeah,
right today.
yeah. And look at this one, oversized parking. I guess for
Yeah.
boats maybe. And
Well-
you put a towboat in there.
Well, you're all right now,
But that's
you could.
phenomenal. I mean,
But they're
that's-
losing millions of dollars
sure
a
they
day
are.
in
Absolutely.
lost earnings.
I was struck by that sign, Ohio River Scenic Byway. It was, I guess, Scenic Waterway now.
Yeah.
But there we are, Scenic Byway. Yeah, that's a little different now. That's phenomenal. It is. Now it says notice the sign, no skateboarding
Yeah.
or bicycle riding. I guess maybe that should be no boating. Now, no canoeing or water skiing
Well,
there.
well, so many people are. Well, right now, they're having people wanting to get out and walk along the levees.
Mm-hmm.
And these levees, a lot of them in Paducah, except for downtown, are dirt. And people wanting to drive on top of it to get out and sightsee.
I'll tell you a quick story about that. Paul Wood, who we know, a good friend of ours, was riding his bicycle down there, and he climbed up on the levees and he was shooed away. And he was very indignant that he was. But Noble Road, this is West McCracken County, pulling.
Well, people don't realize they could damage the levee.
Right. That's a fire hydrant.
Fire hydrant.
And so, well.
It's a hazard now.
It is. It's a hazard of navigation.
And this is not uncommon to have the little islands created.
Right, little high
people
spots.
try to sandbag and endure.
Right.
And well, this kept getting higher and higher and higher.
Right.
And we keep getting rain, and
Greenway.
it all comes down.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's the Greenway, and it's now the waterway.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
the
look what
debris. Well,
yes.
Dan Shepard and I were talking about that. It looks like you could almost walk on that.
You
but of course you
probably could in places.
But it'd be very dangerous. You
very
fall through.
dangerous. You go through.
And once
And
again,
no telling what you get
of course,
into.
Oaks Road is a very low-lying area anyway. That would be Clark's River backwater on Oaks Road, wouldn't it? Yeah. Oh, look at that.
Well, currently we have some of the most severe damage that we've ever had from flooding.
Oh yeah.
And this is bad, but compared to 37,
Oh sure.
it's bad, but not to this
Exactly.
scope there was then.
Yeah.
So we're most
Oh,
fortunate
look at
in
that. Said Road. Now I was also, that's the Reedland Ball Field, and Tom Butler and I were talking before the program, and Dan Shepard. That's underwater almost completely now.
Well, that's another thing. In 37, they didn't suffer as much damage out because there wasn't anything there.
Right.
Paducah was only down into.
Now this is a shot that my son and I took. That's the Mayfield Creek at Old Highway, Old 45, which is 13 or whatever the number is. We still call it Old 45. But the debris there and how swiftly flowing that's how swiftly that normally is a well, in the summer months it's just almost empty, the creek is.
Yeah.
And it was really going along. I will tell you a very quick story about that. We were there yesterday and I saw what I thought was a water snake in the water, and it was circling. And I thought, this is going to be a fantastic photo op. And I got down there and I was firing away and thought, this is great. And then when I got down close, it was a stick, and it was just circling in the water. So I thought, that tricked me. And my son, he'll never forget that one, which is fair enough. But and again, now this stretch of water on 1820, this is going toward Melbourne. My son and I got through it in our car, and this fellow said, "Well, if you guys can make it in your car, I can make it in my truck." So he took off. Now, so I'll get your picture, and he was heading that way. That's about 100 yards across there.
Well, when you start, if you get a wake going ahead of you and don't slow down.
Exactly, and we did. We kept
as long
a
as
steady
you keep
pace.
moving, you have a good chance of getting
you did,
through.
and we got through there.
So people, they need to know, and even if they have driven in water, you don't know the bridge is there.
Exactly, and
you don't know that the road bed
well,
is
if
there.
you remember, Governor Burt Combs died. He tried to cross a swollen creek on a bridge, and he was swept away. That's the block. The road is the block there at 45. And someone told me that that bridge may be severely damaged, and that was another reason that they decided to close it. That's 1820. No, we didn't go this. We stopped there and decided we'd pressed our luck quite enough at that point. But you can see that's going toward the Mississippi. To the right-hand side is up to where the main part of Mayfield Creek is, and that's phenomenal. It'll be interesting to see how many days it takes for this water to go down. And then everything, I have noticed where the creeks are up, there's a coating of mud.
Oh.
And
what's the residue?
Exactly, and that's something maybe in the time we have left, and we've got about, 4 minutes left.
Well, something ought to be said about what happened in the 37 flood
the cleanup,
in particular.
That's the thing.
Not only the cleanup, but that water was so widespread that it was not uncommon for it to cover cemeteries. And one of the phenomena, it was quite common to see bodies floating down the river. And some of them have been dead a long time.
Yeah.
And they would just pop up out of the ground.
Yeah.
And, well, who were they? What were?
Well, along those lines, in Katrina, there was a photograph of a coffin up in a tree.
Yes.
That floated out. And of course, again, I've read stories that before the Paducah Waterworks was hooked back up, they actually built little outhouses over manholes in the streets.
Oh, yeah, they were called the secretaries.
The secretaries, I like that. And
they were built for the ladies in particular, over open manhole.
They were.
They had sort of like a pissoir for men.
Exactly,
but, sort of an open-sided thing.
Sure.
But, after cleaning up the Citizens Bank, their vault was underwater. And people had lock boxes, and they brought in mangles, and they had people hired to come in and iron. Here you see the flood went up to the bottom of the old Citizens Bank under the clock.
And I think this is one of the most interesting shots in the flood, because that clock is still there, although it's now whatever the bank it is. But you drive by in a car, and you look up, and you think, you could just about in a boat reach up and touch that thing at the height.
You could, and that right there was one of the most dangerous bits of water in Paducah, because Third, coming out of Third Street, hitting downtown Paducah, the current was stronger than the one on Broadway, and so he hit a boat and throw you into
the side of a building.
The side of a building.
Sure.
And I talked to two people who had to jump out of their boat, and their boat sank, and here they were stranded down there, and there was ice in the water. And they found a passage to a second floor, and a man was hiding out up there illegally, and he had a stack of, wasn't coal, it was
coke.
And he was burning coke for heat because it didn't make any smoke, and the police couldn't see him. And so they dried out there and managed to save themselves.
Another story I've heard you tell is the rescue of the baby. They were released a couple of times.
Yes,
that happened?
A couple of times. And the one we did, there was an instance of the two girls. One girl fell out of the boat, and she was just a baby, and she started floating off. And a man jumped out of another boat and rescued her. But her great-grandmother jumped up and fell in and was drowned.
Oh, I didn't
know
that.
Now, another one story, we had a guy coming down Jefferson, I believe it was, and he had refugees in the boat, and a passing boat went by too fast.
Swamped it.
And then it started going up and down, and this woman got scared, jumped up, and fell in. Well, as that happened, the man who owned a bookstore downtown, who later became a mayor,
Tom Wilson,
had just gotten out of the hospital with pneumonia. And here he was going down, and he saw it. He went in that cruddy water and rescued the woman and pulled her out. So that happened many times
I'm sure.
during the flood.
I'm sure. And you know, in the water, hyperthermia would be immediately a problem with it.
Get you quickly.
It would be. It's it's
deadly.
Phenomenal. Yeah, yeah. And well, I believe you had told me that the flood in 1913? When was the flood?
13.
That it was warm weather, and people just sort of frolicked in it.
Oh, they had fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the 37 flood, the winter flood, it was just altogether
In
different.
1913, it got into downtown Paducah on Broadway, but it only got up to the curb of the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So you
could
waded
waded it, yeah, and splashed around.
Yeah,
And,
so-
but you know, you had mentioned before about people saying that they never thought it would get that high. I don't know how many people in that program that was in the newspaper. We invited people to write in
Yes.
their flood memoirs, and a lot of them said, "Well, it'll never get higher
No.
than this."
Yeah.
That well, and not that, and they
Yeah.
kept moving it back
Moving
until
it.
it was like this epic disaster like that.
Well, in 1937, I was in Sturgis, which had 4 blocks that was not covered by water. And this one man lived just about the 5th block down. And he said, well, I'm not going to move. Said, I was here in 1913, and it'll never get any higher than that. And he went to bed that night, and he woke up, and he heard something. He reached over and turned on the light, which was kind of dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, electricity was up. And the light came on, and he looked up and saw his shoes floating out of the bedroom.
Well, that would be quite a shock.
It was
Good
to him.
heavens! Wow, wow. Well, let's as of when we were speaking today, we've had some dry weather, which we've been calling a drought jokingly, and let's hope this drought continues, and that this thing won't be as catastrophic as people feared it would be. And but it'll be interesting to see how long it takes to recover. I know it'll be a wonderful sight in Paducah when you see the crews coming down there, taking those floodgates out and taking the sandbags away, and hopefully we won't be visited with this kind of a disaster in a few more years. We're out of time. That hour went by before I knew it. Thank you for joining us. My guest today was John Robertson. I'm Barry Craig, and thank you for joining us. And stay dry and think dry thoughts. See you next time.
Thank you.